self-defense is going to happen within touching range. And if you look at it as a hockey fight, which most fights are, you watch World Star Hip Hop, you watch YouTube, you've been in fights before, you know those things happen at extremely close quarters, right? And if we're here 4 feet away squaring off at each other, that's no longer self-defense. We're fighting, and we're absolutely both going to jail. So that sensitivity that you would get is the same as if someone's trying to grab my sleeve or reaching around for my lapel. You're understanding that you have an awareness, a kinesthetic awareness of what's happening. It's vale-tudo in Spanish or vale-tudo in Portuguese. The Western translation or the English translation would be all in fighting. Anything goes, right? No holes barred. So they're in essentially every style of art that you can find, there's some semblance of that. Again, finding the fundamentals. Regardless where you go, there's going to be an all-in type of style that's out there. It was the poor man's sport. It was for the brown guys in the favelas who couldn't afford kimonos, who couldn't afford anything other than fighting in their trunks. And they learned a holistic approach to fighting where the really rich Scottish generation Gracies owned a lot of the plantations, had a lot of connections in parliament and in government, created most of the kimonos in Brazil, and only taught the people who could afford it. Well, when it came down to it, you had those huge rivalries between
And we're live. Welcome back to another Gutter Fighting Secrets Tactical Podcast. Today's going to be Tactical Podcast number 31. We are here today with Alen Chambers of 36 Chambers Defensive Arts based out of Philadelphia. So Alen has been into martial arts for a long time, and I'm talking about since childhood. And Alen actually has one of the more impressive resumes that I've ever personally seen. And guys, I've seen a lot of them, you know that. So I'm going to start here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's long, but I'm going to read a few key points here. So CVT method, Chambers vale-tudo, Philly self-defense founder in that. He also has black belts in obviously Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is no small feat. He's got pancration second degree black belt, Jeet Kune Do, Kali, full instructor, Spec Ops Kali and military JKD level 3. Let's see, FCS Kali, Filipino Combat System, Philadelphia Training Group leader, Kung Tao, Salat, Green Sash, Small Circle, Jew Trap Boxing, Level 2, Finger Locking, Professor James Houdon, okay, Combat Handgun Combatives, Practitioner, Level 2. I could just keep reading your resume here, Alen, but it's too long. I can't do it, man. But we'll get into some other cool stuff you've done. First of all, before I get too excited, welcome onto the podcast, dude.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
I got to ask off the bat, man, how do you find time to do all this stuff and get all these crazy instructor certifications?
I love martial arts and every aspect of it. And I started when I was really young. Pursued it for many years, and as I got older, I got deeper into sports and wound up leaving martial arts. But as corny as it sounds, they never really left me. So what that allowed me to do is kind of pursue the, I guess, intellectual side of it, and really start to look at books and philosophy and a lot of the other things behind it, which I did and I still do up till now. And as I got older and older, I kind of found myself going back into it when I was in college, and never stopped since, and always pursuing additional things. So, well, I think to answer your question plainly, I would say for me, finding the similarities between all these different arts has helped me learn. Because for me, learning is an endeavor. It's something that one of my coaches told me that you need to learn how to learn, right? That's Billy Robinson, who passed away several years ago. that was always my pursuit, and it wasn't the rank, and it wasn't the art. It was just insatiable hunger for learning and testing these things out and playing with them, and then expressed through my teaching when I'm focused on combatives and self-defense.
You mentioned learning the philosophy behind all of this stuff, because frankly speaking, today with mixed martial arts and everything, and I know you do vale-tudo, but it's kind of lost. The philosophy of, the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, so to speak, is kind of lost. And guys aren't looking into like the philosophy of Chinese martial arts or even Japanese. How important do you think that is for guys, even modern MMA guys, to be studying that stuff?
It really depends. One of the first things that I ask people, or when people ask me what the best style is, or what should I be looking for, or I do this and this and this, those are all great. I think martial arts in general are great. I think it really depends on your intent, right? What are you trying to do? Do you need to be a, quote, martial artist and do all these philosophical things and meditate and learn calligraphy and do all these things that are kind of really, really traditional that aren't part of our culture to begin with, but they are great pursuits if you're going to fight MMA? And do you see a difference in the type of artists that do? Yes, right? For an example, you might say Anderson Silva, you might say Lyoto Machida, you might say George St. Pierre, on and on and on. And they've studied a multitude of different arts. And what happens is they wind up becoming extremely proficient in all of them, gaining rank in all of them. But you see the way they approach their characteristics, their mannerisms, everything really highlights at least what I feel, what a true martial artist is and what it encompasses. So do you need it? No. Should people be looking at it? I really think so. There's way more value that people don't get to see. There's way more than just punching and kicking.
Especially when you reach the higher levels, for example, jiu-jitsu black belt, you're capable of really inflicting quite a lot of harm on an individual very easily, and especially an untrained one. So to temper that with a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of learning about, right and wrong, so to speak, would be, I think, a great idea.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And there's arts out there that are, really, really traditional. There's arts that are less traditional. You look at BJJ, which I'll just preface this by saying, if it sounds like I'm picking on one art versus another, I feel I can only do that because I've experienced them myself and trained and probably have rank in them. So I do pick on BJJ sometimes. But I do it because I love it and because I'm very passionate about it. That's kind of lost in BJJ. BJJ, to be honest with you, it's a sport. And it's a great sport. It's tons of fun. But those elements that came from Japan are lost. And in some ways, it's really a shame.
Yeah, and it's funny, you travel to different schools and you see different things, right? Some schools, like, they have more, and I think it's honestly the teacher, right? He brings the professor, he brings the vibe, right? Some are really traditional and you bow and it's respect and no talking on the mats and that type of thing. And then others are just a free for all and people are coming in late and everything. But for the most part, I think you're absolutely right. But then you go and study another art like JKD, and I think you find a lot of kind of philosophy and, in between learning the bong and the pak sao and all of that, you kind of, what would Bruce Lee say about life and everything? Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would, if someone had to ask me what my base was, I would probably say Jeet Kune Do. And even though I've done some other things probably longer or as long, I would say just the philosophy of JKD I've studied for many, many years, and Taoism and Buddhism and just tactics and strategies for fighting and all those kind of self-perfection style of things. But I would say, yes, those are absolutely in there. You can codify everything Bruce Lee kind of put together, which a lot of it was his own. A lot of it was borrowed from other sources. I don't think that's a secret to anyone. And you can definitely apply that equation to pretty much any type of fighting art. And it's only recently where you started to see people actually use that and start to say, hey, you can do this and this and this. A great example, John Danaher, who I'm very fond of. I think he's an incredible instructor. He's always been on my bucket list. I was aware of him 10, 15 years ago when he was teaching at Henzo's Academy, which I've been to. I never had a chance to train with him. But one thing that he talks about a lot and has become extremely popular, one thing I'll pick on with BJJ with, there's a lot of regurgitation, if you will. So a lot of people hear one thing and then regurgitate it, especially if it's on YouTube. Danaher will talk about double trouble. That's nothing more than ways of attack. And you see ways of attacking in fencing, which is in JKD. Single direct attack, attack by combination, hand immobilization techniques. Those are all things that are universal to whatever art you're trying to do. And if you're aware of those, you can apply those to any art. My big thing is give attribution where it's due is the place where it usually doesn't happen.
Now, Bruce was a really interesting guy. You know, I'm no expert in Buddhism, but I think the concept of kind of like tamping down your ego is a Buddhist thing, if I'm not mistaken. But Bruce actually had a pretty big ego, and I would too if I was him. Where do you think you can draw the line in a martial artist, especially a competitive martial artist, between having a big ego or an ego in general, and then using that whole martial Tao, that martial way in saying, I want to try to like control that ego?
Good question. Good question. I don't think you could pursue a truly combative art or style, I should say, or sport without having some semblance of ego. I think it's along the path that as you start to achieve more and more success, whether that's winning competitions or achieving different ranks, that your knowledge and skill and your self-awareness will increase as your ego hopefully decreases. Now, that being said, it's a play. It's definitely, if you're looking at Taoism, it's the play of yin and yang, right? So it's the hard with the soft, and it's the ego with the why do I even need to have an ego, right? And I think you need to have a happy medium of both. They both interplay with each other, but at the same time, just because I may be able to injure someone doesn't necessarily mean that I should or that I even want to, right? And along those same respects, even if I have to realize the consequences behind that, which not enough people understand, especially in a combative context.
It's so interesting because, you know, you bring up combatives, and a lot of guys are trapped in the kind of reality-based combatives type of thing. And I love it. I've studied it for years, but I also talk a lot of trash about, you know, the RBC guys. You know what I'm talking about. The double eye gouge and the, you know, stomp on his testicles and walk away type of deal. But is there a lot of value in studying a sports geared system to integrate into your RBC techniques?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
And I'm probably going to lean more toward the grappling aspects of it, because in my opinion, that's truly the range that self-defense happens in, right? Self-defense doesn't happen 15 yards away, right? Are there cases where that can happen? Absolutely. Most cases happen within 1 to 3 feet, right? Second range is 3 to 6 feet. Beyond that, I would probably start to question whether or not that's truly self-defense, because anything in that range is more probably geared toward projectile weapons, in particular firearms, most likely. So to do an art or a style that's grappling centric, it's pressure tested. It's constantly pressure tested. So whether that's Greco-Roman or Sambo or catch, that's, you know, a big portion of my grappling, BJJ, regardless of what it is, that's pressure tested to the 10th degree. So if it fails, you cannot lie. The minute, and it sounds like a corny term, but in a lot of martial arts, they'll say, you know, let's touch hands. And it's essentially the sensitivity that you may have that some people might be familiar with Wing Chun, right? Let's touch hands, that sensitivity, which is a high level of skill grapplers have inherently from training. And the pressure that you're constantly put under mentally, physically, someone's literally trying to choke you to death or throw you or trip you or any of those things. Those are stressors that oftentimes the reality-based self-defense systems don't practice, right? Either because it's too dangerous or because they're afraid to really do these things, right? There's always a limit where you can apply. But my feeling is that these particular stressors in these particular arts, you cannot replicate. They're probably the closest you can get to actually simulating a real fight. That being said, there are rules.
Yeah.
We're wearing pajamas, right? That's all the goofy things. You're on mats with gentleman rules, with guys looking out for each other. There's a big difference. It's great, but it's also really bad.
Now, you bring up Wing Chun and the sensitivity drills. How much value do you think that type of stuff actually holds for learning how to survive a combative situation?
Depends how it's taught. So if, again, I think people need to be well-rounded. For me, the way I teach it and my interpretation of it is that it builds an incredible amount of sensitivity. And that sensitivity is inherent anytime you're doing any type of grappling in particular, right? So for me, that self-defense, as I mentioned earlier, self-defense is going to happen within touching range. And if you look at it as a hockey fight, which most fights are, you watch World Star Hip Hop, you watch YouTube, you've been in fights before, you know those things happen at extremely close quarters, right? And if we're here 4 feet away squaring off at each other, that's no longer self-defense. We're fighting, and we're absolutely both going to jail. So that sensitivity that you would get is the same as if someone's trying to grab my sleeve or reaching around for my lapel. You're understanding that you have an awareness, a kinesthetic awareness of what's happening. So that being said, you're already hand fighting. You're already passing. You're already maybe not necessarily using a tan sao, bong sao, but if someone tries to reach across and grab my lapel, I'm doing the same motion, right? It's the same exact thing. So for me, it's huge. And it oftentimes gets until things explode, like I mentioned earlier. I think I have a love-hate relationship with Joe Rogan. But for years, he essentially talked shit on traditional martial arts. And it wasn't until his buddy, Tony Ferguson, started playing with a Wing Chun dummy informally, where he thought it was the best thing ever. Huh. And prior to that, Anderson Silva was doing it, and no one talked about it.
Interesting. Wing Chun is one of the most overlooked arts, I think, personally. I don't have much experience. I did it for maybe a year, but I did it enough to kind of figure out that, like you were saying, not only is it great for sensitivity and grappling, but it really does give you sharp reflexes, I think. And there are, to your point, there's so many guys out there who talk a lot of trash about quote-unquote traditional martial arts or even reality-based martial arts. And that's such an MMA thing or a jiu-jitsu thing, We're the best, we're capable of whatever, choking you a million different ways, and screw all the other martial arts. But I think, like you're saying, dude, like if you can study a lot of different ones, you're going to be such a more well-rounded and a better person, not only combatively, but just in general. Yeah,
absolutely. And my analogy is always a forever white belt, right? So it's if you're always a white belt, you're constantly being humbled. You're constantly, and that's the one reason I love grappling art so much, because any given day, someone's going to be there that's better than you, or you're going to have an off day, or you're going to be tired, and you can do these things at essentially 100% without seriously, for the most part, seriously injuring each other, as long as you have good partners. And that gets lost a lot. And Wing Chun, people need to start exploring these different things. And I'll give another analogy real quick. Guru Dan Inosanto, which was Bruce Lee's best friend, is essentially carrying the torch at 83 years old for Jeet Kune Do and Filipino Kali, amongst other things. If it wasn't for him, and this is my opinion, Thai boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would not be part of MMA or nearly as well known as they are now, simply because of him. His students were the first students to train with the Gracies in their garage and spread it around all over the country. So that being said, his analogy that he gives a lot is that, what's your favorite food? So I'll ask you, well, what's your favorite food?
Chicken tikka masala.
Okay, chicken tikka masala. If I said that's your favorite food and you love it so much, you know how to make it, maybe make it for your family, make it for yourself, make it for everyone. Everyone loves it too. Are you okay with only eating that and only making that for the rest of your life?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. So why would you do that? And especially in the self-defense context, why would you ever do that?
So a lot of times I've heard, especially from my professor in BJJ, he always says, dude, you got to focus on one thing in order to get good at it. And then you can branch out afterwards. I never personally really agreed with that. What would be your opinion about something like that?
Yes and no, right? So oftentimes people will get frustrated and they'll try and find the next thing, right? So there's his advice in that context is very much true, right? And this happens a lot with BJJ. It happens a lot with boxing and kickboxing now, right? What's become more popular is the fancy move. And I'll just pick on 10th Planet for now. Nothing wrong with 10th Planet. I admire it. It does have a substantial catch background to it. But what you'll see is guys doing crazy moves and they can't escape side control, right? You'll have guys doing white and blue belts doing crazy leg locks, but they can't escape mount, or their only escape from mount is some crazy trick in order to get into a leg lock, right? For me, those are poor fundamentals because they haven't spent the time to get good at one thing. And they're so focused on learning a 10-count combo from Dutch kickboxing or doing something else that they don't focus on the fundamentals. So I think the lowest common denominator is the fundamentals. If you have good fundamentals, you can pretty much do whatever you want to and understand those fundamentals are everywhere.
Very great answer. I don't think any jiu-jitsu guy could disagree with that at all. So you are a vale-tudo guy. What exactly is vale-tudo for you guys who don't know?
Good question. So I get that a lot, and most people would say it's the precursor to BJJ or closely related to BJJ. And I can't argue that point. The reason it's paying homage to the kind of ancestral roots of a lot of my grappling, but primarily not BJJ. And vale-tudo just means anything goes. It's vale-todo in Spanish or vale-tudo in Portuguese. The Western translation or the English translation would be all in fighting. Anything goes, right? No holes barred. So they're in essentially every style of art that you can find. There's some semblance of that. Again, finding the fundamentals. Regardless where you go, there's going to be an all-in type of style that's out there. And it's paying homage to that, but at the same time, it's catch wrestling roots. So most people don't realize, and I've had tons of arguments about, but if you look back at the history of BJJ in Brazil, it traveled there primarily because of catch wrestling. And exposed to people and highly influenced by catch wrestling. And it's an homage to that. And if you really look deeper into it, it was all-in fighting. Some people might say it's an early MMA, but it goes back to pancreation, right? It goes back to, leaving the coal mine after 18 hours of work and, take a couple shots of whiskey and having all-in fights. And that's wrestling, that's boxing, that's grappling, pretty much everything but weapons. And the as you can see in my history buff, one of the things that I love about it so much is that this art and style of you could say vale-tudo, or I should say style in general, or approach, was the poor man's sport. It was for the brown guys in the favelas who couldn't afford kimonos, who couldn't afford anything other than fighting in their trunks. And they learned a holistic approach to fighting where the really rich Scottish generation Gracies owned a lot of the plantations, had a lot of connections in parliament and in government, created most of the kimonos in Brazil, and only taught the people who could afford it. Well, when it came down to it, you had those huge rivalries between BJJ and essentially Luta Livre, and they fought in the context of vale-tudo. Well, who won? We don't fight MMA with kimonos on anymore, right? And everyone's in the heel hooks now. So for me, the poor guy won. The guy who was uneducated, who didn't have the money, but he learned the art and he learned the science of fighting. from a catch base, but they pay homage to that. And I don't think you see that on the other end of it. So that's my long-winded answer.
That's a great answer. I learned a lot there I did not know about. So when it comes to kimono versus no-gi type of thing, what do you think is more practical for the streets?
I get this a lot. I'm going to say no-gi.
Yeah.
Lots of people are going to say you're out of your mind. Now, funny enough, I did a class on Instagram this past week about just that. Not into a whole lot of detail as far as the approach of the method, but the kimono teaches you an immense amount about leverage and about balance and what I would call kazushi, which comes from it's off balancing from the Japanese arts, and you usually see that in judo. It's unbelievable for building grip and awareness of your neck and your structure. But besides that, it doesn't really go past there. I mean, you could essentially get to a, say, BJJ blue belt or maybe a judo green belt and have enough knowledge to last you a lifetime for anything that would have to do with self-defense on the street, in my opinion. Everything else is going to be focused on having proper grips, and grips don't necessarily mean these grips. They're control points. So that's why I feel kind of the lowest common denominator would be no-gi. And if you can supplement it, which you should supplement it, with some type of kurtka training or judo-gi training, or kimono training in BJJ, it helps. But I don't think you really need it, to be honest with you.
So the guys who just go in there and say, I don't care about rank, I don't care about that gi crap, I want to get in the cage and fight, man. Like, they're not actually wrong when it comes to learning how to fight. Like, you'd be fine if you never touch the gi at all.
Yeah, until you have to. Yeah,
right.
But it's one of those things. And again, do you want to eat chicken tikka masala all the time, right?
Right.
If one time, for example, we're in quarantine, you can't get one of those spices. You can't get marsala. You can't get chicken, and you have to substitute pork or tofu or something else, right? Either you're going to make it or you're not going to make it. And if you've never had tofu or you've never had other additional spices, you're lost. You're confused. Yeah. So for the most part, as far as MMA, it's going to be sports specific. And for self-defense, do you need to know if someone else has gi training and they grab you? Probably. You should probably know how to do that, right? You should know what it feels like to get choked or choked unconscious or armbarred. If you've never put yourself in that situation thinking that, your art is supreme or all the 15 things that you've done previously are going to help you, and you encounter something you've never seen before, good luck.
How would you feel about doing primarily no-gi in the summertime when there's not a lot of clothing, perhaps a beach fight, something like that, and then a lot of gi in the wintertime when people are wearing jackets, hoodies, that type of thing?
I think it's good. I'm always a proponent for cross-training. And I've had discussions like this before, primarily with weapons and everyday carry weapons. Mm-hmm. So for you and I, that's completely applicable. But if you live somewhere, say Florida, you live somewhere on the West Coast, you live someplace that doesn't necessarily get snow or rain in the winter months, your dress attire is very different. Say you're in Hawaii, right? You're wearing flip-flops and T-shirts and shorts almost all year round probably, right? Yeah. And your carry situation is going to be completely different, right? You may never encounter anyone with a heavy jacket on, right? Yeah. So it's adapting those things to your environment, your situation, and understanding those. They're really literally different for every single person and every environment. If I'm a doctor, I can't necessarily carry what you may carry. If I'm a construction worker, I can probably get away with carrying certain things you may not, right? Yeah. And it all depends on what you have, what's around you, and what your intent is.
You bring up EDC and even concealed carry, I think is what you're getting at here in a way. How do you feel about the guys out there who say, I've got my CCW, I carry my Glock, I've taken a few crowd courses, I don't need much else, I'll shoot the guy if he comes at me? What would you say to those types of guys?
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. Yeah. It's for a long time, I was teaching firearms safety and firearms fundamentals along with the self-defense and combatives at my school. And I stopped doing it. My partner and I stopped doing it at the gym because it was so ridiculous. Typically there's two schools, right? It's very binary, right? And this is a great time to talk about it. And there's, by no means do I want to get political, but there's way less people, at least interpretively, you would see in the middle. It's really, you only see two ends of things, right? Mm-hmm. You see left or you see right. That's essentially the same approach you would see lots of times in self-defense, but particularly with everyday carry, concealed carry, weapons, right? Either you're a weapons guy or you're not a weapons guy. And if you're a weapons guy, I'd say 99% of the people I've encountered don't train in anything else, or they have very, very little training and think that tiny little bit of training is, just enough to cover them because they're going to rely on their fixed blade or whatever they're carrying that day. And then you have the martial artist, loosely I'll say martial artist, who believe their style will protect them, yet they have no knowledge of anything weapons, never trained with weapons, never encountered a weapon, yet their style is supposedly going to protect them against the weapon. So the winner is going to be in the middle, right? The person that has the largest opportunity and awareness to adapt typically is going to be the winner.
Yeah, I like that. It's a very ninjutsu thing to say, if you don't adapt with changing times, that you will perish. And I think it's so true. Being able to have a knowledge about weapons, whatever they are, but also not rely on them too much would make you a really solid fighter or warrior. Now, I know you're a knife guy. You know a lot about it. They scare the shit out of me, man. If
they
someone
should.
was, yeah. So there's two kind of schools of thought, like you were saying here with the knives. It's either run the hell away or grab something and hit them over the head or whatever, or, work your disarms. If you train them enough, you'll be able to pull it off maybe. What's your opinion on, disarming a knife?
I'll say disarming in general.
Okay.
For me to teach someone, and I've gotten this a lot because there's other arts out there, and again, I'll pick on Krav, and they're not the only ones. Lately, BJJ has done it quite a bit. Lots of times their focus in some initial classes or classes to the public, which primarily entails people who don't have martial arts backgrounds, is to teach a gun to the head disarm, to teach a knife to the neck disarm. Or I've seen plenty of times in BJJ, someone thrust a knife at someone and they somehow magically disarm it. So in that context of disarming, I think most disarms are mostly luck, to be honest with you. I've trained them for many, 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 many years, and I'm not 100% confident I could pull them off. On top of that, for me, in my opinion, you need to truly understand what that tool is in order to exploit it, right? So, and if you look at it in a martial arts context, because there might be some people listening or watching that have no awareness of any type of weapons. So if your style, we'll go old school UFC, your style kick is a Thai kick, a traditional Thai kick, and then my style kick is a Wing Chun kick. You've never seen my kick. You've never seen anyone kick like that. All you've seen is maybe a front push kick teep and your typical cut kick in Thai boxing. And out of nowhere, I do an oblique kick a la GSP and a bunch of other guys it became really popular with. John Jones. You've never seen that, and I seriously injure you. That's going to be a serious injury, right? And because you didn't know how to react to it because you've never seen it. So understanding the mechanics, understanding how a firearm operates, understanding how a knife functions, for me, is your first step in understanding how to defend against it. And for me, understanding proper range and distance and awareness is first. Second, understanding what that tool and how that tool is used, right? If I give you a hammer and I say, hey, can you screw that pitcher up? You're going to go, well, this is a hammer. And you go, use it. You'll figure it out, right? It's definitely not the best tool for this situation. So understanding from, and this is, I think, the biggest separation between those two kind of binary parties that I mentioned, it's the unwillingness to understand what the other one is trying to do, right? So they're polar opposites. So if you actually spend time and learn just the fundamentals, learn your grips, right? Learn your grips that you would in BJJ as a white belt and as a blue belt for firearms. If your intent is truly to understand self-defense, take that time, understand a firearm. I'm not saying carry one. I'm not saying make your own. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying understand it better so you can defend against it if that's your opportunity and that's your goal. Otherwise, you're going in blindly. You're trying to cook tikka masala with all these ingredients and no pot or pan.
Yeah, well said. This brings up pankration, and this is something that's fascinated me for a long time. And so from my understanding, pankration is the old Greek fighting art that perhaps the Spartans would have used.
Yes.
This is a lot like MMA, only a lot more street, I guess I could say. Can you give us, for those of us out there who don't know much about pankration, first of all, can you start with a little bit of history, a little bit of what exactly it is and was?
Sure. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier. It's historically, it's probably one of the oldest arts out there. Now, some people will argue, on the arts that supposedly Bodhidharma took to China and eventually took to Okinawa and so on and so forth. But the style that made up pankration is probably the oldest style out there, if not one of the oldest styles. And some people say it was developed on its own. Some people say there was absolutely Chinese influence into it, which I'm sure there was. There's a huge continent, the Silk Road, all of that mixing and mingling. But essentially what it was is a very early style of MMA. And it did have rules. Primarily, for the most part, it was Greek and then kind of evolved with the Romans. The Romans tried to make it a little bit safer, if you will, and incorporated some additional guards and wraps and some other things until they considered the Greeks to be extremely barbaric, which is kind of funny. But to go along with that, essentially it was boxing, right, with grappling, included kicks, all different styles of grappling, submissions, breaks, and typically it continued on till someone gave up and raised a finger. Or until someone completely quit or died, essentially, is what the end case was. Now, there's really weird rules around there. You couldn't, I don't believe you could eye gouge formally. You could not eye gouge. And I believe groin attacks, direct groin attacks were off limits. Besides that, pretty much everything else was legal. Now, there were, again, all-in styles of pankration, which were typically not spectator sports, or at least Olympic sports, which were absolutely all in, just all out brawls. So what that wound up leading into was a separation into more boxing focused, kickboxing focused. And that itself led into essentially catch wrestling is what it eventually became. And you see catch wrestling really start to find a spot in Wigan and Lancashire in the UK.
Now, you're a catch wrestling guy. What exactly is catch wrestling?
Good question. So if you go by my friend Josh Barnett, he would say it's the violent art. And in many ways it is. Again, I've been very fortunate to train with some exceptional instructors. I would say my main grappling instructor is Sensei Eric Paulson. That's who I received my black belt from. But I've had the opportunity to train in many different styles of catch. Up in Canada with Chris Yaskevich, I'm a coach under him. Mike Martel in a Japanese style of catch wrestling as well. Billy Robinson, as I mentioned earlier, and several other people. What essentially it is a no-gi wrestling style that does have submissions in it, but the submissions were a byproduct of proper control and pinning. Now, every style is slightly different. Some focus just on throwing the opponent to the ground. Others focused on pinning solely. Others were more kind of all-in style fights, similar to the pancration that were in there, and they're all together. And there's many different styles of catch. Again, some people, there's purists that are going to say, some of the things I'm saying are incorrect, but catch wrestling as a whole is a no-gi style of grappling that is wrestling-based. It's where leg locks came from, without a doubt. It's where I can't give 100% of credit, but it's highly popular, the double wrist lock, which is essentially the BJJ Kimura. There's stuff that goes back thousands of years that you can see in Southeast Asia. So I can't say catch developed that, but leg locks formally come from catch wrestling.
Are you a big leg lock guy? Do you like the whole, I know you mentioned, John Donahue, right?
Yeah, Danaher, yeah.
Danaher. You really are a big fan of the don't ignore the one half of the body?
Yeah, I'm a fan of his to a point. Giving attribution, I'm a stickler for. Okay. As being a teacher, as having a title that some people may call me, some people may call me professor when I'm teaching BJJ. I don't formally ask anyone to call me anything, but as a professor, I'm going to answer your question in a roundabout way. As a professor, I have a responsibility to professionally teach in a manner that's representative of not only the style and art that I'm teaching, but to also give credit where it's due. And this is where I start having some issues with some people, particularly in BJJ, but it's in every art. Should you ignore any part of the body? Absolutely not. You would be stupid to, right? It would essentially be ridiculous. Again, if you find someone that's great at leg locks and you're competing, you've never done a leg lock, good luck, right? You would be silly if you deciding to do any of this in any semblance of reality and ignore a part of the body. So that concept is not new. As far as what John Danaher is doing, he's built incredible champions. He has a great work ethic, amazing athletes and students, and I truly do respect him. My issues with giving credit where it's due, his lock flows have an origin, which don't get expressed, and those are in Japanese catch wrestling. So I'm very passionate about that because my instructors that have learned catch wrestling formally, that learn the Japanese styles, don't get the credit that's due to them, in my opinion. And my roundabout answer is I absolutely love leg locks, but I love all locks.
We see, and I'm sure you've seen the movie Choke with Enzo Gracie, and we saw in that movie where he was going up against these Japanese catch wrestlers and just dominating them. Do you think that that's BJJ per se, or is that more Henzo being a freaking beast?
It's both. It's both, to be honest with you. So Henzo's incredible. I've talked to him many times. I've been at his school. He's an incredible guy. So I can't say enough about him. I have nothing bad to say about him whatsoever, anything even neutral. He's a legend in the sport and the art. But that being said, again, you're looking at Japanese catch wrestlers who had a wrestling background, but for the most part, guard wasn't used a whole lot, at least not the way BJJ was used. And you see lots of times early on in early MMA, you saw this even with sambo players in early UFC. They really were not aware of some of the positions, or at least well-versed in the similar positions that BJJ would use. You saw a lot of sambo players, which essentially is a catch background. It's essentially folk styles of wrestling, native to Europe and Russia, and mixed with Japanese jiu-jitsu for the most part. But anyway, you would see, for example, a lot of those guys get choked from the back or get choked in guard, similar to what you saw in the catch wrestlers in early MMA and Pride, because they're unaware of those positions and they're not drilled that much. They're not highly awarded the same way sport BJJ is. So if you're not exposed to it, you truly can't defend against it, which you saw, you really saw highlighted early on.
From what I understand, BJJ, when it first was around, was more about the guard game than anything else. It wasn't what we see it is today. Is that true?
I would say yes and no. So if you go to sport versus sport, the intricacies in the guard now are nowhere near. It's Ferrari versus Mini Cooper from 1960. They're completely a different level. It's like comparing Babe Ruth to a modern baseball player. So in their own rights, they're nasty. Fundamentals transcend both. So what's happened over the years, even in the past 10 years, you're starting to see very few people use closed guard. I would say defining guard as closed guard versus open guard. Very few people use closed guard anymore. So if you look at it that way, the older style is absolutely way more geared toward closed guard, which is way closer to some of the older styles of judo and Japanese jiu-jitsu. But that context, that was created for self-defense, right? Even judo had elements of self-defense in it prior to 1945. And everything was based on getting someone to the ground as quickly as possible to finish the fight or to disarm them, as opposed to sitting there and choking them, right? Which, in my opinion, doesn't work too well in a self-defense situation, right?
So you bring up the whole combat judo before 45. Our Marines were using it a lot against the Japanese in the Pacific and whatnot. I really like that photo that you put up with the E-tool, the shovel versus the bayonet. Now, this is something that really fascinates me. Obviously, gutter fighting secrets. We talk about Fairburn and all of that. I guess you could say instinctual type of fighting. Now, how do we take something like Fairburn's system, Defendu, gutter fighting, and it's so simple, but then we're going up against somebody who's a BJJ guy or, MMA, Muay Thai, whatever. Is that stuff still applicable against today's fighter?
Depends on the context, right? So my background amongst other styles of jiu-jitsu, I've been, again, a shout out to my instructors, Clint Sporman and Ralph Grasso, who I've been with and under for many, many years. Those guys would probably put it way more bluntly than I will. It depends on the context. If you're taking a traditional martial artist, and I'll use traditional loosely, say BJJ or even an MMA guy, and put him in the context of self-defense, and you have someone that focuses just on self-defense, like Defendu, one guy's not going to be aware of a lot. And again, you have two sides. Sometimes you'll have guys who are out of shape, who don't necessarily have good footwork, but are just tough, right? So there's a lot of different factors in there. I'm always going to side with the simplicity, especially under high levels of stress. You have to rely on gross motor skills. So really simple tactics, like in the World War II combatives, are probably some of the easiest and best things that you could do, but there are huge holes in it, right? Their ground stuff in particular is very poor. But you see guys like my two instructors who have spent a lot of time developing the groundwork and learning catch wrestling and learning deeper into the Japanese jiu-jitsu and judo styles as well. So those, you need to be well-rounded to answer the question. And I think if you're just coming from a MMA or BJJ background, you're going to wind up missing a lot. Although the stress levels in the fight is something that is to their advantage.
Let's talk for a second about something a lot of BJJ guys kind of loathe a little bit, is takedowns. So I should immediately pull guard, right?
Yeah.
How do we go about training takedowns? I mean, you're a wrestling guy, and I always have found that wrestlers are just able to dominate in this field. But when it's a guy who doesn't have a lot of wrestling or maybe never wrestled, how do we compete against a true wrestler?
So I'll answer the first part of that first. So, it depends on the tactics, right? If you're competing, and you're going to have multiple submission-only fights in one night, being efficient should be at the top of your list, right? Not only you being extremely fit, but also being efficient with that. So I can understand you wanting to take it to the ground quicker, especially if points are not highly awarded on your feet, particularly with, say, throws, right? So for you to get 2 points for a throw, as opposed to maybe passing guard and getting the equivalent amount of points, you're probably going to side toward that, which I understand. It's a play in efficiency. It's a play with kind of the laid back nature of BJJ and its origins. But at the same time, if you go against someone who knows how to wrestle, you're going to get smashed. Mm-hmm. And you're starting to see more and more of wrestling being incorporated into BJJ, especially the past 10 years in particular. How to deal with it? Cross-train, right? You have to be able to cross-train. You have to understand that. And to go back to Danaher's guys, those guys wrestle constantly. And Henzo was one of the first guys that I saw publicly talk about wrestling. And if you go to his school, he has wrestling practice, I think 2 or 3 times a week. They threw their wrestling boots on. They wrestle for hours with Columbia wrestlers and Brown wrestlers and Cornell wrestlers, and everyone goes through the ringer, and they're open about it. And they go, yeah, we're wrestling right now. Most other styles or at least systems are going to say, no, we don't do that. This is all BJJ, right? And it's clearly not. So you have to understand both sides of it, how you approach those tactics depending on what you're doing. For example, I'm going to have a hard time competing against a Division I national champion wrestler. He's going to smash me, right? So maybe I have to employ other tactics or other things in wrestling he may not know, and try and find my advantages that way.
Do you think that the whole concept that BJJ is the only equalizer against somebody who's wrestled, especially at a higher level, is a true statement?
No. It's you can get a high school wrestler, a good high school wrestler. Doesn't have to be a national champ or a state champ. You get a good high school wrestler. You teach him to keep his back straight and his head up, and say we'll take out leg locks because we'll say he's going against a blue belt, right? Or even a purple belt. We'll take out heel hooks. Say you have him keep his back straight, keep good posture, not sink his head down is probably my number one. And you start to understand that don't extend your arms or your legs too far. There is no pin. Don't worry about it. Use the pin to grind and do the things that are, in some cases, illegal in folk style or freestyle wrestling. That little bit of knowledge and a few weeks of training will beat most blue belts and purple belts, sometimes even higher.
Yeah.
That's from my experience. No,
mine too. And I'm not a high-level guy like you. I'm a blue belt. But that's been my experience too, is that these wrestlers advance in rank like nothing else. It's crazy to watch.
Yeah,
now, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was going to say, because the fundamentals are there, right? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Because of the stances, because of the footwork, because of the extremely hard conditioning, most BJJ guys would not be able to do a youth wrestling practice.
Yeah.
I mean, the kids, when I was teaching,
man.
Yeah, when I was teaching youth wrestling, these kids are running stairs for 45 minutes. Then they're doing calisthenics for 20 minutes around the track, doing lunges and push-ups. And then they go technically wrestle. And then that's all skill-based after they shadow wrestle. And then it's actually time to wrestle.
Damn.
Right? Now, that if you'll see that in World Champs maybe, but you never see that for your average practitioner or BJJ. They wouldn't be able to do a normal kids practice.
Yeah, that's some Spartan stuff right there. That's crazy, yeah.
And that's the mental toughness, that's the awareness, and the amount of fundamentals focused on proper alignment, proper footwork, proper stance. Those are the things that the weapons guys don't want to work on. The conditioning is not what they want to work on. The reality of what they need to do and how fit they need to be is what's in their domain, and they're fully in control of it. So wrestling, in my point of view, is as hard as any other traditional martial art, and in my opinion, is a martial art.
Yeah, mine as well. And I wish I would have done it in high school, man, because like you said, it's Spartan and it's just so hardcore. You don't find that elsewhere. And I wish they had like adult wrestling classes around me, but I haven't found it yet. Maybe we'll talk offline later about that. I see that you have some certifications from FEMA. FEMA Emergency Management Institute Active Shooter and Emergency Management Institute Workplace Violence Awareness. So I know that these certifications you got are, to do with martial arts, to do with self-preservation. Nonetheless, they were from FEMA. So I want to ask you something a little bit off topic, but I'm sure that you'll hit the nail on the head. We are living in a crazy time right now. We're seeing freaking global pandemic. We're seeing instability in the streets as we speak. What would be some advice if you could give to martial artists who are either sport guys, traditional martial artists who don't think a lot about emergency disaster preparedness? Could you touch on that a little bit for our guys?
Sure. So, and that all stems from my background, not only in self-defense, but understanding self-defense holistically, right?
Yeah.
So self-defense isn't just in the dojo, the dojang, or your gym, or whatever it is at your house. It goes above and beyond that. It's protecting your family. It's understanding situations like this, right? So I'm very fortunate to be working and where I'm at. But there's tons of people and friends of mine and students of mine, family members that are out of jobs, that don't have jobs. And unfortunately, what you're starting to see is what
I think we lost Alen here for a second. Coincidentally speaking, just as we're getting into the crazy stuff here, let's try to get him back. Guys, stand by, and we will get Alen right back with us. So we were literally in the middle of getting into the good stuff here, and the forces behind the wall freaking cut us off or something. So you were literally just saying that you believe that this kind of is an all-encompassing thing when we talk about being able to prepare and protect ourselves for times like we're living in now.
Yeah. So it really is all encompassing, right? It's not only self-defense and self-protection. It's are you prepared for a pandemic? If you own a business and it goes out, are you prepared? If you're, for example, in Minnesota, if you're one of the small businesses that gets damaged or looted, are you prepared to reopen? Mm-hmm. Is what you're doing sustainable? All these different things. It's not only with business, it's everything, your family, everything. Are you valuable to other people? Do you have a service or a skill that can help other people in times like this? I think it really highlighted that. And unfortunately, what's going to happen is that lots of jobs are going to disappear because there's going to be people who are figuring out that all that important. That doesn't mean they're not important to you or to me, but they're not important as far as continuing. So as far as survival, it's all encompassing. That doesn't mean you go build a shelter in your backyard. I mean, if you do, great, right? That's cool. It's up to everyone to understand what the possibilities are and what you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones and your family. And to be honest with you, out of anything, and it sounds super corny, to help each other, right? Yeah. You're seeing more and more people divided now than ever. And to be honest with you, it's just don't be an asshole. If you need help, right? And you see this in times of crisis when there's flooding, when there's other things, tornado. I don't care what part of you're from. I don't care what color you are. If you're drowning, I'm going to try and help you or do anything I can. And if you look at things from that perspective, it helps us all to be a tiny bit nicer.
Well said. Prepare for, financial instability and financial security, as well as physical instability and physical insecurity, and you'll be a hard target. And I think that that's, really what we're all talking about here is, how to make yourself more into a hard target and how to help others once you've done that to get, on that same understanding of things as well.
Exactly.
Alen, I could honestly talk with you for another hour here, but I know you've got to go. So I'm just going to say maybe we'll do a part 2 at some time if you're ever available again. But thank you so much for coming on, man. I've learned a lot from you today.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. And I look forward to doing more of these if you'd like.
Awesome. Sounds good, man. Well, I'm going to let you go. Guys, until next time, I know you know what's coming. Please remember that you are your first and last line of defense. And I will see you on the next Tactical Podcast. Alen, thanks again, bro.
Thank you. Have a good night.